No, good morning, Mr. Gill.
Good morning, my lord. Apologies for the slight delay in starting. One of the witnesses was held up with travel arrangements, but we only have these two witnesses today, so there's no knock-on effect in relation to our time for today.
Right, good morning.
The two witnesses we have today are Christopher Clanacan, who represents the organisation Equality Network. Mr. Clanacan has already given evidence to the inquiry on an earlier occasion. And Florence Olds, who represents Scottish Trans. Their statements are respectively SCI-WT 0300 00001 and SCI-WT 0332 and then again 501. Christopher and Florence, can I begin by confirming with you that the statements that you've given to the inquiry for these hearings are the evidence that you would wish to provide to the inquiry at this stage?
Yeah.
And you've both signed your statements, and we can take those. Yeah. And I think you're also both aware, and Christopher, you've been here before, so you're both aware that our hearings are recorded and they are also transmitted on our YouTube channel. Christopher, can I begin with you? You are the Policy and Campaigns Officer of the Equality Network, and you've been in that role since last year, I think, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And so we're clear you weren't in that role during the pandemic. You were, I think, working for another third sector organisation.
Yes, that's correct. I worked in the third sector prior to that and have been involved heavily with our COVID work since joining.
But I think you've consulted with the director, the former director of the Equality Network, and other members of your staff, and you've been given information regarding the impact of the pandemic.
Yes, that's correct.
Florence, you are the Policy and Public Affairs Officer with Scottish Trans.
Yes.
This is a role I think you took up in January 2022.
Yeah, that's correct.
And prior to that, I think, again, interestingly, because we'll come to this in due course, you were an intern with the Scottish Government, where you worked primarily on EQIAs.
Yes.
And in particular, record keeping regarding vaccine certification.
Yes.
Interestingly, I noticed in your statement you also co-founded an organisation called Glasgow Mutual Aid.
Yes.
At the start of the pandemic in May 2020. Could you just tell us a little about what that was and why it was established?
Yeah, so it was a group of people who lived in Glasgow. I'd not long moved to Glasgow myself, and like many other groups across the whole of the UK and indeed across the whole world at the beginning of the pandemic, obviously lots of people were scared to go outside. They didn't know how to do so safely, especially those who were vulnerable because of disabilities or because they were elderly or other things like that. So we set up a network of essentially volunteers or people who were interested in Glasgow in order to connect them with their neighbours. We worked on a sort of postcode by postcode basis, and we connected individuals who were interested in, say, fetching shopping or doing people's dishes or fetching medication and bringing that to them.
How long did that organisation exist for? Is it still in existence, or did it just cover the pandemic period?
I think it lasted until probably about 2022 and then slowly petered out. I think towards the end we mostly referred people to other services, but it was most intensely active, I think, in 2020 and 2021.
Yes. And again, probably an obvious question. It obviously met a need.
Yes.
Was it appreciated?
I believe so. I think lots of people appreciated it. There was some concern that, similar to how I believe food banks were established to fill a very specific role at a very specific period in time, and now are sort of a fundamental part of how sort of people get by in the modern day. I think we were also concerned that we would go from being a small interim measure to a fundamental part of society, and we did quickly hear that people from, say, the job centres and other citizens' advice were referring people onto us, and we were just a group of people on a Slack channel trying to figure out how to get food to people.
Thank you. The Equality Network, Christopher, can you tell us what it is or was during the pandemic, and also the connection that Scottish Trans has with the Equality Network?
Absolutely. So the Equality Network is a national organisation in Scotland working to improve the lives of LGBTI people, and we focus primarily on the equality and human rights of LGBTI people across the country. We were established in 1997, and since then have played a key role in advancing equality and human rights for LGBTI people in Scotland. We do that working in partnership with the community themselves, with other stakeholders, and including the Scottish Government and public bodies and agencies. Scottish Trans is the trans-specific project of the Equality Network. So it's not a separate organisation, but focuses on the equality and human rights specifically for trans people.
Am I right in thinking from your statements that your organisations were essentially, at the beginning of the pandemic, strategic organisations rather than service providers?
Yes, that would be correct. The majority of our work tends to be on policy, and so we sit in strategic working groups for the Scottish Government and other public bodies like Police Scotland. We do community engagement around and community development as part of our work, but the primary focus is on policy and influencing at a strategic level.
Okay. In the course of the pandemic, did you have to change your organisations in any way to be service providers? Were you providing any services?
I can answer that. Is that a question for me?
Sorry, yeah. In a way, posing it to both of you, and whichever feels more able to answer it, please do.
I'm happy to answer that question.
Please.
In terms of service provision, one thing that did change during the pandemic for Equality Network was our role that we played in distributing funds to other LGBTI community groups across the country. We had an existing relationship with the Scottish Government because our core grant comes from the Equality and Human Rights Fund. But in addition to that, during the pandemic, we were seen as a trusted intermediary to the community, and so the Scottish Government was at the time distributing funds to support communities during COVID. And we, along with other LGBT organisations in Scotland, applied to the Scottish Government to various different funds in order to distribute that to the community. So if that counts as service provision, then that's one change that we made. I do have details of the different funds that we applied to and the amounts, which I've provided to the inquiry before.
I should have said that we have access to various documents that you provided to us, and obviously all documents will be looked at as we progress. When you say you provided funds to various organisations, was that also providing funds to an intermediary who would then provide funds on to individuals? Was that the idea, or?
I'm to the best of my knowledge, no, that wasn't the case.
Right.
It was primarily directed towards community groups and other organisations to support them. For example, local sports groups, inclusive LGBTI safe space sports groups, other youth online sessions, other LGBTI groups to run prides, etc. So to the best of my knowledge, no, we were distributing the funds to individual groups and organisations.
Okay. Thank you. Come to some of the groups in a little. But again, Christopher, in your statement of paragraph 13, you talk about funding, and you've hinted at that just a moment ago. Just taking it forward to 2021, so I read it, there were previously 3 sources of public funding, but they were all rolled into one in 2021, called the Equality and Human Rights Fund. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you also say that Equality Network has what you term unrestricted funds,
Yes.
which can be used for campaigning and other projects which are not funded by the Scottish Government.
Yes, correct.
So, I take it those are, in comparison to the public funding, relatively minor, but they can be used.
Yes, so our core grant, the majority of our funding comes from the Equality and Human Rights Fund via the Scottish Government, but administered by Inspiring Scotland. Our unrestricted funds comes from other funding sources that we may have applied to. It may come from donations, fundraising, training activities that we deliver around LGBTI inclusion in the workplace and society, etc. Those funds are separate from our Scottish Government grant, and those unrestricted funds allow us to do some of the more political and campaigning and otherwise activities that are not covered by the Scottish Government grant.
Thank you. You also mention that both of you that prior to the pandemic, neither of your organisations were involved in any of the government's pre-pandemic planning exercises. Now, with the experience that you both have and have gained during the COVID pandemic, would you consider that your organisations should be involved in any planning exercises should there be a reappraisal by the government of the way in which planning for such events takes place? Florence, perhaps you first.
Yeah, of course. I think we definitely should be. I think that equalities and human rights and different protected characteristic groups or groups that represent those with different socioeconomic status, for example, should be considered in any prior pandemic planning. I suppose a lot of what we talked about in our statements is the way that we might be impacted differently as a group compared to the general population, or we might have specific concerns or needs that need to be, say, communicated in a specific way. And so I think planning in advance to tailor different aspects of messaging, for example, from the government, would be a very sensible thing to do to prepare for pandemics in future.
Christopher, you anything to add to that?
I would wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah. Even with I suppose, looking back, and we do know about certain of the exercises that the Scottish Government carried out on planning for emergencies such as a pandemic. Do you find it slightly surprising that within the last decade, prior to the pandemic, you and your groups weren't included in pre-pandemic planning?
I suppose to some degree, I'm not very familiar with what their pre-pandemic planning looked like, so it's hard to say. But I will say that generally our experience is that Scottish Government are very good at engaging us on any matter that could possibly affect us. We work a lot with several different teams from across Scottish Government, and there often is that equalities consideration, and we're often there with, say, race organisations or faith organisations who we often work alongside. So it is a little bit surprising, but I'm not sure if they did have that equalities perspective.
Christopher, again, anything to add to that?
Not much to add, other than my experience from speaking with staff was that we were not consulted during that time, but once the pandemic did start, we were regularly consulted, and we were in regular contact with the Scottish Government.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, looking at more, I wouldn't say substantive issues, but looking slightly more at the substance of what you say, can I begin with a reference in your statement, Christopher, at paragraph 31, where you say that there wasn't a single unified LGBTQI experience during the pandemic, Indeed, you go on to qualify that, and you say far from it. Now, with that in mind, I wonder if I could ask you about, having read your statements, two perhaps rather generalized assumptions that may be made about your communities. And this may be true of other communities as well. But two generalized assumptions, and then we can perhaps structure our discussion around these assumptions. The first one is an assumption that the LGBTI community is primarily formed of a young demographic, perhaps largely urban-based, and is relatively able-bodied. And the second assumption is that those within your communities have a supportive home network or home environment in which to isolate during lockdown or perhaps when shielding. So just bearing in mind those two assumptions. I'm going to deal with the first. You do both make reference in your statements to disabled members of your communities. Can you tell us just a little bit about the challenges that they faced during the pandemic? Florence, perhaps you first on disabled members.
So in a report that Scottish Trans published last year, the Scottish Trans and Non-Binary Experiences report, we heard from, I think it was 571 trans and non-binary people across Scotland. And we asked them if they identified as disabled, and this definition included, it was mostly the Equality Act definition, but we clarified that it includes things like mental health conditions, physical health conditions, neurodivergency, and chronic illnesses as well. And I believe it was 67% of the survey identified as disabled in one of those ways. So we do generally find quite high correlations between the trans and non-binary community and the disabled community. As mentioned, there are many different ways that this occurs. So there's high correlations between neurodivergency, so things like autism and ADHD, and people who are trans and non-binary. But there's also large crossovers with mental health. That's not because being trans itself is a mental health condition, although it has been historically categorized this way, and then that has since changed. It's often because of sort of like the social stress of being a minority that can often be sort of targeted and persecuted. So a lot of trans people live with a lot of anxiety around how they have been treated and how they may be treated. But there is also a lot of crossover with things like chronic illness and chronic pain as well. So I think sometimes it's not always the case that there is a sort of exact middle of the Venn diagram that only trans disabled people experience. Often it's just the layering of two different kinds of oppression and problems on top of each other. So for example, if you are a disabled person who is trans and you need a personal assistant or a carer, for example, to come into your home, you're trying to find someone who can both be specifically supportive of your disabilities, your needs, but you're also trying to find someone who respects you as a person, will refer to you correctly, and that's often quite difficult to find. And then if, for example, in the case of the pandemic, if you are someone who is, for example, shielding from COVID, is more vulnerable to COVID, you also have to find a carer who is someone who will take those precautions seriously, which is, of course, not always the case and continues to not always be the case. And sometimes, if you're relying on public care provision, you might see a different person every time. So it's, I think, more the stacking of these different kinds of troubles that people face that is a real problem that our community has, and this comes out across different areas of life, so employment or using things like benefit services, for example.
Thank you. Krista, is there anything you want to add about the wider LGBTQI community that may have been disabled during the pandemic?
Yes, thank you. And just to reiterate the statement that I did make in my witness statement about there being no one experience of LGBTI people, that is because we are humans, like everyone else in society, and all of our various identity characteristics intersect with each other, whether it's disability, socioeconomic status, and so forth. Particularly on the point of disability, as well as individual community members who were disabled. We heard from community members who told us during the Let's Be Heard project, the listening project of the inquiry, they told us that they were shielding with a family member who was disabled, and that actually made their life more difficult due to a lack of information from the social care department. They told us that they did get information from the social care department, but it was not clear, they were not very communicative, and their quality of life was even harder to look after that family member. So when we think about disability, not just individual community members, but potentially those in family and close friend groups as well.
Thank you. The other part of the assumption, the first assumption that I mentioned, was the older cohort of your communities. I said that it was perhaps your communities are generally thought of as a younger, and you're probably examples of it, but at least from my perspective. So far as the older members of your communities are concerned, was there a particular problem that they had, and in particular, I'm probably thinking about digital communications, but presumably may have been others. Chris, can you begin with that?
Yes, so it would be a wrong assumption to assume that the community is just full of young people. In fact, our community spans of various age ranges, and there are many LGBTI people living in Scotland who are older. I think the experiences that we heard from older community members through our research was, for example, potentially a digital skills gap, and engaging with their community and other services online on platforms like Zoom and Teams and so on. Another intersection that we heard for older people actually was older LGBTI people who were living in rural locations also had additional challenges, and that's because in these rural locations there's oftentimes a lack of visibility of their community, or potentially more socially conservative attitudes, and so life might just be a bit more difficult for you if you are living in a rural area. I guess something that we may touch on later is the loss of Pride events during the pandemic, so I'm happy to elaborate on that.
I am going to come specifically to these loss of events and also loss of support groups.
Yep.
That's very helpful. Also, I think, again, both of you mentioned that there are members, and I suppose this applies across the board to all communities, members of your communities who lived in areas of socioeconomic deprivation. Was that a feature that you came across and encountered during the pandemic? Florence, perhaps you first.
Yeah, I believe so. Again, to refer back to the report that we published last year that I mentioned earlier, we found that trans people seemed less likely to be in work than the general population, and also less likely to own their own home, more likely to be renting. So sometimes because of issues we faced, like things with employment, we might be more likely to living in rented housing, or living with family, or living in a friend. And then also, I suppose this does tie in directly to the digital exclusion point. People may be less likely to have things like phones and laptops and private spaces where they could engage with, for example, online social groups or online pride events or things like that. That would be ways that members of the community who did have better digital access, who perhaps had more resources, more space, more privacy, that would be a way that they would be able to connect with their community. But that might be harder for those who are experiencing that socioeconomic disadvantage. And I suppose in terms of things like access to green spaces or local infrastructure where they could leave the house and exercise, that also might be an issue as well.
Chris, anything to add to that?
Yes, in particular we heard from experiences of LGBTI pregnant women who were living in poverty during the pandemic, who told us that they found found it very difficult to access support, financial funds, and also because of digital poverty and not having the relevant technology, they found it difficult to access information and healthcare during that time as well.
Thank you. Now, I think, Chris, you were a step ahead of me, but come to the question of support groups and other groups, and we'll look at some of these individually. Support groups for each of your communities, I'm assuming, were, prior to the pandemic, groups that could meet in person and offer advice, offer support to other members and share experiences. Those obviously ceased, certainly at the outset of the pandemic. What effect did that have on your members? And Chris, perhaps you could start by looking at that.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a few things within that. I think one, in terms of support groups, we heard from individuals who were part of LGBTI inclusive sports clubs, and those sports clubs provided a safe space where their identity would be respected. Those groups oftentimes are situated in urban areas, and so if, for example, a community member was living in a different council area and was not permitted to travel because of the council restrictions, they were prevented from going to their sports club in safe space. That was the case from various community members we heard from. But the second point within that is, I think what you're referring to is the celebration of Pride and the Pride events that take place across Scotland every year. The loss of Pride events, which are in-person gatherings where the community and our allies come together to remember the past struggles for equality and to look forward to the future. The loss of those events had a huge impact on the community. And it's quite hard to communicate the importance of Pride, because it's not just a celebration, it's not just a parade, it's very much grounded in a historical protest, and still remains a protest today. And the energy at Pride is about bringing people together and acceptance. And we heard from community members where they were not able to attend Prides in person and were able to attend some Pride events online, that didn't quite capture the same spirit and the essence of Pride and what Pride means to them. We also heard examples where Prides could not go ahead in rural locations across Scotland, which in our cities, our Prides are very established, but there are more rural and smaller Prides popping up across the country. And those are really important to reach community members who are potentially not as much engaged in the community, or they are there's a lack of community in their area or lack of visibility of acceptance. And so those cancellation of rural Prides also affected quite a lot of people. As I mentioned, some Prides were able to take place online, and we actually had a role in facilitating some funding to groups for them to be able to continue their Pride events online. The reaction to that was mixed from community members. Some community members found that attending Pride online was really good for them because they didn't need to be in a public space and it was very accessible, whereas, as I mentioned, other community members told us that it didn't feel the same and it didn't quite capture the essence of Pride, and they were happy when in-person events were coming back.
Thank you. There's a few things you've mentioned in that answer. If we can just look at them in some more detail. One of the groups that you mentioned, Christopher, in your statement is the Leap Scotland group, which is, I think, a sports organisation.
Correct.
To what extent was that significant within the LGBTI community, and to what extent was it impacted during the pandemic?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, the issues with sports clubs and the need for LGBTI inclusive and safe space sports clubs. Leap Sports is a charity in Scotland. We work regularly with them. They're one of our partners on various projects and engagement, and during the pandemic we applied in partnership with Leap Sports to the Scottish Government Supporting Communities Fund, and we then obtained I believe it was £14,000 that was dedicated to sports groups as part of a larger grant, and so us and Leap Sports were in partnership distributing that to other sports groups, as I've mentioned, because of the need for LGBTI inclusive spaces. Those, to the best of my knowledge, Leap Sports groups happen across the country. They're involved with many different LGBTI inclusive organisations across various sports, and as far as I'm concerned, do fantastic work.
You've mentioned several times in the last few minutes the expression safe spaces. And can I pick up this first with you, Florence? Mm-hmm. And can also pick up a point that you make. It's at paragraph 39 of your statement, where you state that many trans people experience discrimination and harassment when going about public life. Now, so far as safe spaces for the trans community, you explain how important that is for your community and to what extent there was a deprivation of it during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely vital. I think for many people, safe spaces are spaces where your identity will be taken seriously, where people respect how you wish to be referred to, where they won't make assumptions about how you wish to be referred to, and where also there is just a general atmosphere of acceptance and inclusion. Often in trans safe spaces, we might never even talk about being trans. We might not discuss that. We might just talk about the weather or what we've had for lunch or whatever. But
politics.
Yes, it's that
Don't
underlying.
Suggest that, but no, maybe not.
It's that underlying assumption that you know other people will see you how you see yourself, or that they won't intentionally antagonise you or harass you in any other way. So those are absolutely vital. And of course, as we've discussed, many of those groups meet in person, often in urban areas, but also in rural areas as well. And so for many people who struggle to access then online services that were provided, that is obviously, of course, really difficult. But I do think on the other side, there were quite a lot of trans-inclusive and trans online spaces, especially during 2020 and 2021. I sort of remember it from personal experience at particular points where there was so many things on that I couldn't go to all of the, trans online events, that even if I wanted to. And also, again, speaking personally, a lot of my friends and sort of the ways that I interact with friends are still exactly the same as they were on 2020, having regular video calls and things like that. So again, leading back to the point around trans people often having difficult experiences navigating world sort of outside of the world outside of their home, especially if they are someone who is looks visibly trans or doesn't pass as the gender they identify with. People often experience harassment, denial of services, things like that. So for many people, having social spaces that they could access from home, if they did have that digital access, was actually a huge lifeline. And some of those spaces continue, but some of them don't. And that's also an interesting impact, is that some people obviously really craved that return to face-to-face, to in-person events. But for some people, if that doesn't feel possible, they suddenly had this world where from their own home they could connect with other people like them. And when services and spaces suddenly return to in-person, those people are still now isolated and had less connection than they did perhaps during the pandemic. So it is complicated, especially for those who are still vulnerable to COVID as well.
Chris, is there anything else you want to say about safe spaces? You've mentioned it. Florence has articulated it. Anything further about safe spaces you want to say?
Safe spaces in relation to LGBTI community groups and alongside community members, nothing on that point specifically.
Okay, thank you. Right. The other assumption that I made reference to a little while ago now was the assumption that when isolating or shielding or simply obeying the diktat of lockdown, that the members of your community had a supportive environment in which to do that. Now, I think I should preface this by saying we have heard from a number of groups, and in particular the collective of women's organizations, of the difficulty that lockdown created for people who were in abusive relationships. So we are well aware of that. But Florence, can I begin with you? You refer to this at some length in your statement, paragraphs 10 to 14. Can you explain why members of the trans community could find themselves in a situation with an unsupportive family and the consequences of that?
Of course. I think this is particularly an issue for younger trans people who may live with their parents, for example, and may have little recourse to live anywhere else or access to other services, especially during lockdowns. But I think, unfortunately, many young people do have family members who don't quite understand or support their identity, may not support their transition, and also to some degree may also sort of actively be against that. They may refuse to refer to them in a way that they wish to be referred to, so they might intentionally use the wrong pronouns, or say if it's a trans man, only refer to him as, my daughter, for example. And these very intentionally not acknowledging how a person sees themselves is incredibly damaging for trans people, especially those who are early on in their transition and perhaps may not be viewed by the outside world as the gender in which they wish to present as. So I think it's really important to understand that while gender identity is something within yourself, it's how you understand yourself, gender is still sort of a social thing that also involves how we are perceived and related to by others. We would all be very different people if we lived on a desert island in complete isolation. And so if the main people in your life that you are living with are family members, again, especially if you're a young person, who don't see you how you see yourself, it's incredibly claustrophobic and difficult, and means that every interaction will be shot through with this tension and this fear. And that's on top of course, the fears that everybody in the early days of the pandemic had about the virus and about when lockdowns were going to end and how the rest of their lives would look. So it's an incredibly difficult situation for a lot of, especially young trans people. And it's also those who knew they were trans or came out or were in the process before the pandemic might have been able to go to, say, youth groups or social clubs or events or prides or spaces or things like that, meet other people like them, learn about the community, learn about themselves. That's going to be a lot harder for people who are just figuring out their identity because of this sort of enforced period of isolation when everything suddenly stopped. And that's obviously especially the case if those unsupportive family members might not be supportive of them, say, attending those online trans groups or using their phone or computer to look up more information about being trans, the support that they can get.
I think one point I picked up you saying just a little while ago about not having private space. Mm-hmm. I suppose one can relate that to a private space within a home.
Yes.
And exactly. Again, we've heard from some of the women's organisations the difficulties that where there was abuse taking place within the home. It was rather difficult for somebody who was the victim of that abuse to go off into another room and try and make a surreptitious phone call to either the police or some other help organisation. I think that is, while obviously slightly different context, is something you can identify with.
Yeah, I think so. And again, especially it may be the case for children or young people whose parents perhaps monitor their internet activity or are, asking who they're on a call to, or which is obviously in many cases very reasonable, but just that there being very narrow margins for privacy and for people to connect with these support services who may make that a lot more bearable.
Chris, is there anything you want to add in relation to living in situations with unsupportive families or in an unsupportive environment?
Yes, I think you touched on it at the start at the start as well, but there was a presumption that individuals would be able to rely on their family members, their neighbours, and check in on each other. And for many LGBTI people, that might just not be a reality. They might not have those connections, or it might be unsafe for them to do so, and it might put them actually in harm's way. I guess that experience, if we think of that from a family perspective, as Florence has mentioned, it depends on the family themselves and if that family is supportive or not. So to add, we did have experiences from community members who had positive experiences of staying at home during the pandemic because their family supported them and affirmed their identity. And that meant that there were less other stressors and burdens on those individuals, for example, financial costs, mortgage costs, rent, etc., because they were living in the family home. Speaking from personal experience, that was also my experience. I stayed with my parents during COVID in a supportive environment, so it was much better for me than if I was living with unsupportive family members. And also the point that you mentioned on domestic abuse and domestic violence. Unfortunately, we heard from community members who were forced to isolate with their abuser, and we heard from some really serious allegations of instances of domestic abuse and domestic violence where people thought that they would lose their lives and that they wouldn't make out of lockdown. So, yeah.
Thank you. Another matter I'd like to touch on with you is the issue of online abuse, which members of your communities were and continue to be subject to. Was it your impression that that abuse increased during the pandemic, or was it simply because everybody was living their lives online and having to use digital communication that members of your community were more aware of it? Chris, begin with you, please.
Yes, I think over the last few years, globally, we've seen a rising anti-LGBTI culture, and the UK and Scotland is not immune from that, and unfortunately that also trickles on to online spaces as well. And looking at the period specifically that concerns this inquiry, that time frame, people were online more because they were at home more and connecting online more. And so community members, myself included in that, were exposed to anti-LGBTI sentiments on a daily basis sometimes. And I also think one thing to note as well, which is particular to the pandemic, is the way that social media has changed over the last few years. And maybe 5 to 8 years ago or so, social media was focused on you would have your platform and you would add friends and accept friends. But during the pandemic, we've seen a rise in the use of the app TikTok and also video reels on Instagram. And those types of social media can show you content en masse from people that you do not follow or who do not follow you. And so you're exposed to a larger amount of opinions, and as you can imagine, those opinions are not always positive. And that was something that we definitely witnessed during COVID. I would say that even although there were less people on the streets and potentially less hate crimes taking place via physical acts, it's more than likely that there was a rise in hate crimes online during this period.
I don't really want to ask you to provide examples of the sort of thing that your communities were subjected to. I think we can probably imagine it. But for members within your communities, is it possible to say that there was a generalized effect of being exposed to that sort of thing on online. Florence, you first.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think, again, it was coupled with that wider anxiety around COVID and around the pandemic. And as Christopher says, I think online hate did increase massively in this period. And with many people being stuck at home with little to do, a lot of people were glued to their social media and probably engaging in very unhealthy habits of just, it's what people call doom scrolling, of just scrolling and scrolling and reading all the bad news and just feeling quite terrible. And I also think, to pick up on a point that Christopher made, is it's my understanding that some social media sites sort of prey on this, that algorithms will show content that's very controversial because it gets a lot of engagement from lots of different groups, and as say trans rights can be a very divisive issue with lots of different groups having very strong opinions. Those are great posts for social media to push and publish and put into the limelight, because lots of people will have lots of opinions about them. But also I think one of the big impacts is that when you're the source of such wide debate, but you're actually a very small part of the population, there's nearly 20,000 trans people in Scotland as of the last census, it is incredibly dehumanising. We often find that, for example, when people who are unsure about trans rights or unsure about the whole trans issue actually meet a trans person and sit down and chat with us and get to know us, they realise that we are in fact just people, just with a specific identity or a specific experience. But of course wasn't particularly an option during many periods in the pandemic, and when we had such wide social media coverage. But I think also an interesting impact that comes out of increased online sort of anti-trans, anti-LGBT rhetoric is, even though it's very much happening online, it can make you feel far less safe locally. As before the last few years, holding a sort of anti-trans viewpoint was relatively quite a niche position to hold, but now it's become more and more prolific, and so you do have that fear that suddenly, when it goes from seeing one or two people who only post about how much they dislike trans people to being thousands of people doing it, you get that feeling that it's more likely that you might encounter someone who has that position. There might be someone who lives around the corner from you who has that position, or perhaps the person who works at the food bank has that position. And so we've definitely noticed that increased attacks online and anti-trans rhetoric online has really impacted people's feelings of safety, well-being, and how welcome they are in their local environment as well. People bring up stickers specifically all the time. Anti-trans stickers make people feel really unsafe, as they know there is someone living in the same area as them putting out these hateful messages that they can see. And I will say, especially as well, that I think there was a big increase in sort of conspiratorial thinking around the pandemic, obviously against lockdowns and vaccines and things like that. And I certainly saw a lot of linking of the same places that anti-vaccine stickers would go, anti-trans stickers would go. There's many different forms of opposition to trans people's rights, some of them we might consider as sort of reasonable concerns, but some of them do verge on very much conspiratorial thinking about there being, a secret trans lobby that controls the government, when really Scottish Trans is for people trying our very best. But I think I can definitely see that that was a time when lots of people were radicalised in different ways, and I think many people were radicalised against the trans rights movement during this specific time, and we definitely saw the outcome of that.
Chris, is there anything further, having heard what Florence has had to say, is anything further you want to comment about online abuse?
Well, yes, not specifically relating to abuse, but one of the positive things we heard about online was that, against this backdrop of anti-LGBTI sentiments online, nearly everyone that we heard to or spoke to in the Let's Be Heard project told us that they had a positive experience on social media and online when they were engaging with their other community members, and so were able to join online support groups and connect with different people who they had not connected with. We heard from someone who decided to produce art during the pandemic, who then posted their art online and was able to connect with other LGBTI artists and collaborate on art, which I think is a really nice outcome to have in what was a very difficult time for many people. I guess this is reflective of my own experience as well. I was able to connect with other LGBTI people that I hadn't been in contact with before during the pandemic via various mediums, not just social media, but also on podcasts and YouTube live videos and discussion forums. But my own personal experience, again, is reflective of the negative as well, unfortunately. Yes. And in order to avoid that, I removed certain social media apps from my phone. I would go for regular runs and try and disconnect where possible. But that's a luxury that not everyone would have had.
Thank you very much. Can I touch briefly on the physical and mental health during the pandemic of your members and the effects on that on health? Again, Florence, if I can begin with you. Obviously, we're aware that transitioning is a process that takes a considerable amount of time and a considerable amount of thought.
Yes.
And you explain this in your statement. And at paragraph 16, you talk about the deprioritization of trans healthcare and medicines. Again, can you just expand on that a little bit in relation to your community?
Of course. So, yes, as you say, transitioning can be a very lengthy process. There's a lot of internal reflection, and then if you're trying to access it via the NHS, there can be incredibly long wait times. I believe those wait times have only gotten longer since 2020. But for example, when I moved to Scotland in September 2019, I got a referral to the Glasgow Gender Identity Clinic, and I still haven't been seen over 5 years later. So these are the lengths of time that people are waiting just to have a first appointment, not even for things like surgery or access to hormones. So even though the reflection can take a very long time, actually accessing the healthcare itself can also take a very long time. And that's especially the case for things like major surgery. So gender-affirming surgery can take, again, there can be long waiting lists, there can be a long assessment time to ensure that you're sort of ready for it and they believe it's appropriate. There can be a lot of like pre-surgery preparation as well. So if you can imagine that there were people who perhaps may have waited years to come out for certain reasons. Lots of people who come out later in life feel like they can only come out after their partner passes away, for example. Then you wait a few years on a waiting list, and then you get seen, and then it's a few years even then before you can get referred to surgery, and then your surgery date falls in April 2020, and suddenly something that you might have been waiting for years or even decades is suddenly not available to you. So I think that was incredibly difficult for people, and the uncertainty around whether this would be treated as essential medical care or not was also incredibly difficult, and whether it would be something that was prioritised. Even within NHS services, we often experience that our like essential medical care is treated as sort of like a lifestyle choice. It's quite common that trans people who are, say, picking up their hormones from the pharmacy are often told, like, are you sure you need these? They're very expensive, it's very unusual. So we're often questioned about why this is necessary. And so I think there was great anxiety about when these long waited for appointments would be available, but also especially for more major surgeries, what the recovery window would be like, what travel would be like, how all of that would work, because that greatly impacts the outcomes of the surgery, as with any major surgery. But then also that is, of course, going to impact someone's sense of self. If it's a gender-affirming surgery that is sort of bringing their body in line with how they think of themselves internally, if that doesn't go well because it's been rushed because of lockdowns and travel bans and things like that, that is going to have an absolutely massive impact on your mental health going forward.
Thank you. Chris, looking at the coming out experience, for those who are coming out during the pandemic. Was that a problem in particular? Did that have impact on health, mental health in particular?
I think that is very dependent on the individual and their circumstances.
I appreciate that,
As I've mentioned, if we heard from individuals who had supportive family during the pandemic and were able to affirm their identity, whether it was their sexual orientation or their gender identity, but we also heard of examples where that wasn't respected, unfortunately. And again, there was issues there around privacy, which I think we've touched on briefly today, in terms of accessing your community and not, if you're not out to your parents or your family or whoever you're living with, but you're trying to connect with your community on a Zoom call in the next room or a phone call, you're much less likely to do that out of fear of outing yourself. So there's concerns for privacy in there too. And I'm not sure exactly, we didn't have lots of experiences from people speaking about their coming out journey. There will have been many, but our experiences were more just in the general sense of family and home life.
Could I touch on vaccines and vaccine certification? Chris, at paragraphs 75 to 78 of your statement, you refer to the, what do you call, the overarching theme of public messaging from the Scottish Government, and particularly picked up at paragraph 77, you say that there was a lack of inclusive messaging and information in relation to vaccines. Can you explain what you mean about that?
Yes, so the overarching theme about pandemic messaging applies across the board.
Yes.
We've touched on it briefly already today, but that is the assumption of relying on supportive family, friends, neighbours, etc., and assuming a very heteronormative viewpoint of how people would have their support networks and access their support networks. One participant that we had heard from had told us that she was banging her head off of a wall because she was not able to go and be with her found family and her support network, and she didn't know. She was very angry at the Scottish Government because she assumed that she would have those lifelines close to her via family, etc., which she didn't have. I think with the pandemic messaging, again, something that we would like to see mindful of future is that assumption isn't taken forward, and different kinships, different relationships are taken into consideration.
Yes, thank you. Florence, you provide us with some more detailed information about the difficulties faced by trans people in obtaining the vaccine, and obviously mindful that you have your experience of working as an intern and in relation to vaccine certification. Within that, you roll up some information, additional information regarding identification for the purposes of vaccine certification, or indeed simply being informed of vaccine availability. Can you just explain that a little, please?
Is this about how trans people sort of access to records? With
Yes.
medical, yeah. So we, as a community, often have difficulty with sort of record systems or identity systems, in part because most of these are built not with us in mind, as obviously most people don't change their gender or their sex throughout their lifetime, but some of us do. And this can mean we can often have complicated or strange or difficult sort of records, and that often means that confirming our identity for, say, like ensuring we can get a vaccine or inquiring about whether whether we're eligible to get a vaccine can be quite difficult. So, for example, you can change your sex as it's listed with the NHS, and that's actually relatively easy to do, and the evidence requirements for that are quite reasonable. And there is there is information from NHS Scotland, like available centrally, about how to do this. But again, because we're quite a small population, if somebody approaches their GP and says, I'd like to change my sex from male to female on my records because I'm transitioning and living permanently as a woman, and I'm waiting to be seen by the gender identity clinic, etc., if that GP has never done it before, they might have no idea what they're doing. And often we hear from people who have quite strange medical records. They might have had their sort of medical records duplicated and then have two, and might be sort of receiving letters for both their sort of male and female self, for example, or like some people's entire medical records are deleted when they ask for their sex to be updated, in part because when you change your sex with NHS Scotland, you have to be issued a new CHI number, because one of the numbers in the CHI number is either odd or even, and that correlates to whether your record is male or female. So in theory, it's also a privacy issue of if somebody saw your CHI number, even if you had, say, like if you were a trans woman and it said female on your records, if you had your old CHI number and it was whichever odd or even correlates to male or female, they might be able to tell that you are trans. So it is a big privacy issue, and it is necessary for that to be able to change. But because of all of these issues, when it came to things like vaccine rollouts and then later vaccine certification, we were often a population that had issues, or often anticipated that we would, even if actually it was completely fine. I remember there was lots of anxiety around some people getting texts inviting them to have a vaccine and some people not getting texts, and I was checking with all of my friends who live nearby whether they got it or not, and it seemed to be completely random. But if you're from a group that often has administrative struggles around healthcare and around other systems, and you're waiting a lot longer than other people, you're going to be likely to be a lot more anxious and a lot more worried that you'll be left out. And we often heard from people who contacted the vaccine helpline, and when they kind of explained these issues, the helpline wasn't really prepared at all in how to support them, wasn't aware of these issues. And this is something that we raised with the Scottish Government, and we did eventually also co-produce, I think it was in April 2021, a resource with Scottish Government to reassure trans people that we would be offered the vaccine, we were eligible for the vaccine, and I think more information about how people could get in touch if they were worried that they hadn't been sent an offer that others had. But again, it is just sort of a broader anxiety we have around interacting with these systems, that you kind of have a presumption that something will go wrong. And this also related to vaccine certification, which, as you mentioned, I was working on when I was at the Scottish Government before joining Scottish Trans. And this, I think, required confirming the dates of your vaccines, but then also using ID to sort of do facial recognition to compare like the photo that you had on the ID with the name that should correspond to the record, and then compare that to like a live image of your face to make sure that you are the same person. And lots of trans people had issues with that, because they might have different names on different ID, a different name on their driving licence to the one on their NHS records, for example, which there's perfectly legitimate reasons why that might be the case. But then also they may have changed their name since they were given the vaccines, and so the name that the vaccine was sort of under and how it would be displayed on the app might be different to the ID that they have or the name that they wanted to refer to. And so, yeah, I think they're explained sort of more in detail in the statement. But people,
yes.
Yeah, encountered all sorts of like difficulties, but also anxieties around this, as they were having the certification was something you had to show to enter certain events or spaces, but also then you might use it to go to certain countries that had vaccine requirements for entry. And so this complicated lots of people's feelings around, suddenly there was this scheme that would allow you to more safely engage with in-person events and go on holiday and things like that. And they were worried that because of how their records have been kept, because of their identity, that these might not be open to them.
Can I just go back again, Florence, if I can just go back to something you said, and I've already referred to it. Mm-hmm. It's something you said in your statement, that many trans people experience discrimination and harassment when going about their public life. Mm-hmm. I think we probably all can remember going to get our vaccines in what looks, my recollection, sort of something like an aircraft hangar somewhere, loads of people there. Was that in any way a problem for the trans community?
I don't recall I suppose I wasn't working at Scottish Trans, and I wasn't aware of anyone telling us that they had issues during that time. I did speak to my manager, who was present at the time, and so a lot of my information about what things were like before 2022 is based on their recollections. But I suppose that is that thing again of the anxiety about how you would be treated, what name you would be referred to, if you would be questioned that why do you have a female name when you look male, for example, like that. You know, are you impersonating someone else so you can get a vaccine, things like this. And even though this never occurred, I never had any problems getting my vaccine. This is the kind of anxiety often from prior personal experience that people have, or even experience that they know other community members have. You know, we can be quite a small, tight-knit community, and so when one person has a problem with their vaccine, it can spread quite quickly, and that panic and anxiety spreads very quickly. And so without sort of the kind of reassurance that we did, say, produce with the Scottish Government being more proactive, these anxieties can really sort of linger and obviously can get a bit out of control when people are just very worried for their healthcare and safety.
Thank you. Just concluding, I suppose now, these hearings that we're having at the moment are in respect of impacts as viewed through the prism of equalities and human rights. Chris, I know that you've got I think Florence has, well, to a certain extent, already deferred to you, so I think this is coming your way. Yeah, you've got a background in human rights law. Can you articulate the way in which the LGBTQI community have had their rights and protected characteristics compromised during the pandemic and the restrictions that came with it? I appreciate that's really a very wide question, and if you could do your best just to provide us with some response to that. If you want to make reference to specific provisions of the Equalities Act or the Human Rights Act, or indeed to other international conventions, please do so.
Yes, thank you. And this is a session on equalities and human rights, and the majority of the things that we have been discussing today and advising are human rights concerns, whether that is the right to cultural life that exists in the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Again, that is a codified right that LGBTI people in Scotland have, and the UK has signed that within international law. Again, within that, it's important to note it's the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And I think the experiences that we've relayed today show that that was not the case for many people, for various reasons, including social isolation, unsupportive family, and lack of inclusive services, and so on. Some of the concerns that we've discussed as well concern privacy, in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to respect for private and family life. Some of the problems that we've spoke about within the family home, again, probably fall under that bracket too. I think with the European Convention, a lot of these rights are qualified rights, but some of them are absolute rights. So in the case of where we're talking about serious domestic abuse and domestic violence, when people are being told to stay at home with their family and partners and being subjected to really inhuman and degrading treatment, there's Article 3 of the European Convention concerns there as well.
Thank you. We've just come to the end of our time. Is there anything that either of you would like to say in conclusion beyond what you've already said? Perhaps an observation that you would like this inquiry to take away from your evidence today?
Yeah, do you mind if I?
Yeah,
so I think obviously we've been talking a lot about the issues that LGBT people and trans people had during periods where there were like COVID restrictions in place. But I think it's also important to highlight that I think as a community we were generally very supportive of these measures. I think lots of people, even if they were struggling, understood why it was a necessity, and that things like lockdowns were very difficult for many people for a number of reasons, but I believe they were also some of the most effective methods of suppressing the spread of COVID, which obviously can be a deadly virus or a long-term disabling virus, as we now know. And so I think many of our community were keen, for example, to get their vaccines, to wear masks where it was required, to, socially isolate if they needed to test, things like this. And so I think it's also it's important, I suppose, of course, you will, as the inquiry, keep this in mind, but that balance that I know restricting people's rights has to be a, proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And I think many trans people and many LGBT people definitely would have had that sense that some things impacted us differently, and it would be good to have consideration and communication and specific comms around this. But at the same time, this was not being done arbitrarily, and I think people generally saw that there was very good reason why their rights were being limited.
Chris, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I mentioned briefly at the start how we were able to access different funds to support the community during the pandemic, and it was felt that the Scottish Government actually did quite well in that aspect, in terms of distributing funds to support the community, both in terms of during the pandemic and the recovery. And the process for the funding during that time was not as stringent as it normally is to funding during non-pandemic times, due to the urgency of the situation to get the money out and support people. So from my colleagues at the time who were working and applying to those funds and in touch with the Scottish Government, it was felt that actually they did quite a good job with that. The only other thing I'll say is that obviously we've given lots of information to the inquiry. I've participated in various forms of the inquiry, and I think it's the participation in the inquiry and engagement with communities has been really good and is a really positive thing. I think I would really like to see the Scottish Government at the end of the inquiry come out of listening mode and go into action mode and take on some of these points and concerns in future planning, but also so that they don't just go and sit on a shelf and people's engagement hasn't been for nothing, but actually we really use this as a positive example to plan for future pandemics and emergencies and try and mitigate some of the disproportionate impacts and negative outcomes for all communities, not just LGBTI people, but for all people.
Right. Florence, Christopher, thank you. I think probably, Florence, you're joining in with what Christopher has just said. Thank you very much for the reflection on the engagement that you've had with the inquiry. Those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gill, and thank you both for your evidence. I'm very grateful. That's all for today, and we're back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Thank you.